Have you ever wondered what a single act of kindness could unleash? You're giving all your money to a stranger's family. Jack said nothing. His hand trembled as he slid the check across the counter, but his eyes never wavered. The bank teller stared at the number, her mouth slightly open. That was everything he had. A sharp laugh rang out from behind. Look at old Jack Bennett. Thinks he's some kind of hero. Jack turned without a word and walked out into the fading light. When dawn broke, 11 black SUVs rolled silently up his dirt driveway. One by one, uniformed figures stepped out, heels clicking on gravel, standing tall at attention. And on the porch, Jack watched, coffee in hand, as his quiet sacrifice rippled across the world in a way no one, not even he, could have imagined. What secret could those SUVs hold? Jack Bennett's days on his Wyoming ranch began before the sun touched the horizon. Each morning he rose quietly, pulled on his worn denim jacket, and stepped out onto the porch with a chipped coffee mug in hand. The land stretched out before him, dry, cracked, and desperate for rain. Years of drought had turned once green pastures into brittle earth, and the small herd of cattle that remained was a shadow of what the ranch had once supported. After his coffee, Jack set to work, tightening sagging fence lines, patching the barn roof with salvaged wood, and tending to a vegetable garden he coaxed from the stubborn soil. Since Margaret's passing 3 years earlier, the ranch had grown quieter. Her laughter no longer echoed from the kitchen window, and her careful touch was missing in the small details, the curtains she sewed, the flowers she planted along the porch. Jack felt her absence in every room, every corner of the land they had built a life on. As Jack worked, his mind often drifted to memories of the Gulf War, to blistering desert heat, the sharp smell of sand and oil, the nervous tension that settled deep in his bones. It was there he met Nathan Collins, a young Marine, with a quick smile and steady hands. They had shared foxholes and near misses, conversations about home and promises to look out for each other. Nathan's face came back to Jack often, especially when the night stretched long and lonely. Veterans Jack knew carried a weight the world rarely saw. The war had followed him home, not in medals or ceremonies, but in sleepless nights, moments of sudden anger, and an ever-present restlessness. Civilian life offered no instructions on how to manage the emptiness that came after the uniform was folded away. Financial pressures added to the strain. Jack's modest military pension and Social Security barely covered the essentials. Every broken fence post, every cracked pipe, every unexpected vet bill for his cattle was a reminder of how thin his margins were. Yet through it all, a sense of duty anchored Jack. Not just to his land, but to the people who had worn the uniform beside him. That unspoken bond, that understanding of sacrifice was why a stranger's family in need stirred something deep in his heart, something no drought or debt could erode. Jack's mornings always began the same way. Before the sun lifted over the Wyoming hills, he'd shuffle into the kitchen, set the old kettle on the stove, and listen to its low whistle as it heated. His fingers moved from habit, spooning grounds into the coffee pot, folding open the creased local paper that had been delivered faithfully to his mailbox since the 1980s. The paper was more than news. It was his lifeline to the town, to a world that had grown quieter and more distant. With each passing year, Jack lingered over the pages, savoring the familiar rhythm of headlines, obituaries, and local notices. But that morning, a name leapt from the black and white print and hit him square in the chest. Emily Collins, widow of Staff Sergeant Nathan Collins, faces eviction after funeral costs leave family bankrupt. His breath caught and the paper trembled slightly in his hands. Nathan Collins, a name Jack hadn't spoken aloud in years, but had never once forgotten. In an instant, Jack was back in Fallujah. He could feel the sting of sand against his face, the heat radiating off the armored vehicles, the sharp adrenaline of a firefight. He saw Nathan, young and steady, pushing through chaos to drag a wounded soldier to safety. Nathan had been more than a fellow Marine. He'd been a brother in arms, a friend who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Jack when survival was measured in seconds. They had promised to look out for each other, to make it home. But some promises were broken by fate. Jack had survived. Nathan hadn't. As Jack sat at his old wooden table, coffee cooling in his cup, he thought about why some names never leave you. They stay because they are tied to the moments that shape who you become. To the faces you saw when you thought you'd never see another sunrise. To the voices that steadied your hand when you wanted to give up. Nathan's name was carved into Jack's heart, not because of his death, but because of how he lived, with courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. And now Nathan's family was in trouble. Jack folded the paper slowly, a weight settling in his chest. He knew what he had to do. Jack sat in his truck, engine idling in front of the First Wyoming Bank, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. On the seat beside him sat the checkbook, the key to his last savings, the only safety net he had left. His mind wrestled with itself in a quiet war. If I drain the account, what happens when the well pump breaks again? When the cattle need feed? When winter rolls in with its long hungry months? But the paper's headline haunted him. Emily Collins, alone with 2 children, facing eviction after burying Nathan. Jack imagined her standing in an empty living room, boxes half-packed, a child's toy forgotten in a corner. He imagined Nathan, the young Marine who had risked everything, watching from somewhere unseen, counting on the men who made it home to stand up when he no longer could. Jack shut off the engine, stepped out, and walked through the bank's double doors. Inside, the small-town murmurs fell quiet. The teller, a young woman named Claire, glanced up, her eyes widening when she saw the check he slid across the counter. Behind him, voices whispered, "Old Jack Bennett." One man snorted, "Thinks he's some kind of savior." Jack didn't turn. He felt the heat of the stares, the judgment, but his hands remained steady as Claire shook. Rick Dalton's mocking voice floated from the corner. "Guess the old man's finally lost it." Jack's heart pounded, but in the quiet of his mind, his path was clear. What's a man worth, he thought, if he can't stand for something bigger than himself? He knew the ranch might not last another winter. He knew no one would come bail him out if things went wrong, but he also knew what it meant to leave no one behind. As the check cleared, Jack turned and walked out into the afternoon sun. The gossip followed him, but he didn't care. Some men measure wealth in acres and dollars, he told himself. But I measure mine in promises kept, and some promises are worth everything. The news spread through town faster than a prairie fire. By evening, Jack couldn't walk into the local feed store without feeling the weight of curious glances and half-hidden smirks. As he stepped through the door to buy chicken feed on credit, old Tom Jennings, his neighbor for 30 years, was already waiting by the counter. Tom leaned in, voice low but urgent. "Jack, you've lost your damn mind," Tom muttered. "Nobody lifted a finger when Margaret passed. Nobody helped when your well dried up last year. Why throw it all away on strangers?" Jack gave a quiet shrug. "It's not about what they did for me, Tom." But the feed store owner shook his head with a sigh. "Sorry, Jack. With the drought and prices climbing, we're tightening accounts. Cash only." He wouldn't meet Jack's eyes as he slid the order slip back across the counter. Walking back to his truck empty-handed, Jack caught sight of Rick Dalton leaning against his pickup across the street, a grin spreading across his face. "Offer still open, Bennett," Rick called out. "Sell me the place. I'll even let you stay in the guest house. Charity for charity, right?" His buddies chuckled behind him. That afternoon, Jack sat in the stuffy waiting room of the local VA office. He'd waited over 2 hours just to hear a caseworker tell him his ranch's value disqualified him from emergency assistance. She gave him a tired, sympathetic look and said, "Off the record, without media coverage or public pressure, the system rarely moves." Jack thanked her anyway. That night, the silence inside the house was deeper than usual. Jack ate a simple meal of canned beans and dry bread at the kitchen table, the space across from him, once Margaret's, painfully empty. He pulled out a worn sheet of paper and began a letter to his daughter, Linda, in Denver. "Linda," he wrote, "I don't expect you to understand why I did this. But some debts aren't paid in dollars, they're paid in honor. Nathan Collins saved lives. His family deserves to be believed in the way we once believed in each other. Take care of yourself. Love, Dad." As Jack folded the letter, he felt the weight of his sacrifice settle on his shoulders, but alongside it a quiet peace. The house was silent, except for the faint creaks of old wood settling in the night. Jack sat alone in his chair by the window, a half-empty coffee mug on the table beside him, the weight of the day pressed heavy on his chest, the feed store's rejection, the VA's closed doors, Tom Jennings' warnings, Rick Dalton's jeers. Outside, the moon hung low, casting a pale glow across the parched fields. Then came the sound that made Jack sit up straight, a soft knock at the door. Visitors were rare at the Bennett ranch. Rarer still at midnight. Jack rose slowly, slipping on his boots and grabbing the old flashlight that hung by the door. When he eased it open, the porch light revealed a woman standing just beyond the threshold. She was in her mid-30s, tall with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Though dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, and boots, her posture gave her away, military through and through. She stood with a kind of quiet alertness, shoulders squared, back straight, scanning her surroundings even as she focused on Jack. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly. "I can't stay." Before he could reply, she stepped forward and pressed a plain white envelope into his weathered hand. "We can't go public yet," she continued, her voice calm and efficient. "But you should know you're not alone in this." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but with a brief nod, the woman turned and disappeared into the night. Moments later, he heard the soft growl of an engine starting, then fading into the distance. Back inside, Jack sat at the table, staring at the envelope. His heart beat fast, torn between flickers of hope and waves of doubt. Could it be real? Was this some cruel joke? Inside the envelope was a simple, unsigned note, typed on unmarked paper. "What you did for Emily Collins has been noticed. Stand by." Jack ran a rough hand over his face. For years, he had believed that quiet kindness often died in the dark, unseen, unremembered. Yet, here was a whisper, a ripple from his act of giving, proof that sometimes when you throw light into the world, it travels further than you'll ever know. The first faint light of dawn stretched across the Wyoming sky, painting the fields in soft gold. Jack stood on his porch, cradling a mug of coffee between his rough, weathered hands. His bones ached from another sleepless night, his mind still replaying the mysterious woman's visit, her quiet words lingering like an unfinished sentence. Then came the sound, not the rattling cough of old farm trucks or the grumble of tractors, but the smooth, low hum of engines, steady and controlled. Jack's brow furrowed as he stepped to the edge of the porch, squinting toward the dirt driveway. One by one, the black SUVs appeared, their polished surfaces gleaming under the rising sun. 11 in total, rolling up the drive in precise formation, tires crunching over gravel with military precision. The ground vibrated faintly beneath Jack's boots. From across the fields, neighbors began to gather, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. Tom Jennings emerged from his front porch, his mouth slightly open, and even Rick Dalton, who had been so quick with his jabs, stood frozen by his truck, the usual smirk wiped clean from his face. The SUVs came to a stop in a perfect line. For a moment, there was only silence, a hush that hung in the air like the pause before a thunderclap. Then, with coordinated precision, the doors of each vehicle opened. Men and women in uniform stepped out: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Their polished boots met the gravel in a synchronized rhythm. They moved into a line, standing at crisp attention, facing the porch. From the lead SUV emerged a tall figure, silver-haired, shoulders broad beneath his decorated uniform. Major General Michael Grant. His stride was measured, purposeful, cutting through the line of soldiers as he approached Jack. Jack's mouth opened slightly, words hovering on his lips but never finding their way out. His eyes darted from the general to the rows of soldiers to the watching neighbors. Confusion clouded his brow. Disbelief flickered in his chest. And above all, a deep, bone-anchored humility settled over him. "Mr. Bennett," General Grant said, his voice firm but respectful, "on behalf of the United States military, I thank you." Jack's fingers tightened around his coffee mug as a lifetime of training stirred in his bones. He slowly raised his free hand, returning the general's salute, muscle memory from years past, a gesture he never expected to give or receive again. He had given quietly, with no thought of reward, and now, standing before rows of soldiers and stunned neighbors, Jack realized that sometimes the world doesn't just notice, it remembers. General Michael Grant stood before Jack on the porch, his polished boots crunching softly against the gravel as he raised a leather folder in his gloved hands. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice carrying just enough to reach the gathering neighbors, "I understand you believed you were simply helping a fellow Marine's family. But what you did carried consequences far beyond what you could have imagined." Jack's brow furrowed, his coffee mug cooling in his grip as he searched the general's face for meaning. General Grant opened the folder, revealing classified documents stamped with bold red markings. Staff Sergeant Nathan Collins wasn't just a decorated Marine. He was a central figure in Operation Iron Shield, an international counterintelligence operation that dismantled extremist financing networks. Before his passing, Nathan provided critical testimony that neutralized 3 major cells across Europe and the Middle East. Jack's heart thudded, his mind flashing back to Fallujah, to Nathan's steady hands, his unshakable focus under fire, the quiet competence that had earned everyone's trust. And now, even in death, Nathan had been serving his country. The Collins family, the general continued, has been under protective custody through the Witness Security Program. Your financial assistance, Mr. Bennett, prevented Emily from turning to public charities or local assistance, moves that would have created a digital trail, potentially compromising their location. Without realizing it, you protected a national asset at a critical moment. Jack's mouth went dry. His eyes dropped to the porch floorboards as the weight of the revelation settled on his shoulders. He had thought he was saving a family from homelessness, and in doing so, he had safeguarded lives across continents. On behalf of the Department of Defense, General Grant said, his voice softening, I am authorized to present you with the Civilian Distinguished Service Medal, the highest honor our nation can bestow upon a civilian. An officer stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. As the lid was lifted, Jack caught the gleam of the medal resting on its deep blue ribbon. His breath caught, hands that had known years of hard labor trembled slightly as the medal was pinned to his shirt just above his heart. For a long moment, Jack said nothing. His gaze drifted over the assembled soldiers, the tearful faces of his neighbors, and finally back to the medal resting against the fabric of his work shirt. He had never sought recognition. Yet now, standing beneath the rising Wyoming sun, Jack felt something shift inside, a quiet assurance that the smallest acts of loyalty could ripple outward in ways no man could predict. The days that followed were like something out of a dream. Jack awoke to the steady hum of engines and the clang of tools echoing across his land. Military crews, Army engineers, Navy Seabees, even a few Marines, moved across the ranch with quiet efficiency. The sagging barn roof was stripped and rebuilt, each plank set carefully into place. The old water well, dry for months, was flushed and repaired by a team from the Army Corps of Engineers. They reinforced the cattle fencing, repainted the weathered porch, and even restored the small garden Margaret once tended, laying fresh soil where cracked earth had been. Jack stood to the side, coffee in hand, as young men and women in uniform worked around him. More than once, a soldier would pause to shake his hand or quietly thank him before returning to their post. Jack, a man of few words, offered a nod and a firm handshake in return, his chest swelling with a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the hills, a familiar car rolled up the drive. Emily Collins stepped out, her young son, Ben, clutching her hand. Jack's heart tightened in his chest as Emily approached, eyes shining. "Bennett," she said softly, "we can never repay you." Before Jack could answer, Ben stepped forward. His small hands holding out a card made of construction paper, crayon drawings covered the front, stick figures of a farm, a house, a smiling man with a gray beard, and a little boy waving. Inside, in wobbly letters, it read, "Thank you for helping us. You are our hero." Emily pressed an envelope into Jack's hand. "This is your check, Jack. We didn't cash it. You shouldn't lose your home for saving ours." Jack felt his throat tighten. For a long moment, he simply looked at the card, then at the woman and boy before him. His rough, calloused hand gently rested on Ben's head. Around town, the story spread like wildfire. News vans lined the county road, cameras hoping for a glimpse of the humble rancher who had turned a quiet act of kindness into a national ripple. Reporters were held at bay by polite but firm military police who explained that Mr. Bennett's privacy would be respected. Neighbors came by first out of curiosity, then out of respect. Tom Jennings shook Jack's hand firmly, his earlier warnings replaced by a quiet nod of admiration. Even Rick Dalton, who had once mocked Jack in front of the whole town, appeared at the fence line one evening, hat in hand, eyes lowered. "Jack," Rick said gruffly, "I was wrong. You're a better man than most of us." Jack offered a small, tired smile. "It was never about being better, Rick. It was just about doing right." And as the sun set behind the repaired barn, the new flagpole gleamed near the gate, its flag lifting in the breeze. The ranch stood stronger than before, not just in wood and stone, but in the hearts of the people who now saw Jack Bennett not as an old man clinging to his land, but as the quiet hero who had reminded them all what sacrifice truly meant. 1 month later, the Bennett ranch stood transformed, not with flashy upgrades or luxury, but with quiet restoration that honored its century-old soul. The barn, once sagging and tired, now stood tall and solid, its wood gleaming under a fresh coat of red paint. New fencing ran sturdy along the pastures where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully, gifts from military units across the country who had heard Jack's story and wanted to show their gratitude. Each morning, Jack still rose before the sun, just as he always had. He shuffled into the kitchen, poured his coffee into the same chipped mug, and made his way onto the porch. From there, he watched the dawn break across the Wyoming hills, the sky spilling gold over the land that had been in his family for generations. Near the ranch gate, a new flagpole stood proudly, its brass fittings shining in the light. A young Special Forces major had installed it himself, setting the concrete with care, refusing help. Jack raised the flag each morning with the same deliberate, steady hands that had once folded the stars and stripes on foreign soil. He watched it rise, feeling the quiet pull of memory and duty as it caught the wind. Every so often, unmarked cars would ease down the country road, slowing as they passed. Their tinted windows hinted at quiet watchers, reminders that Jack's one act of kindness had echoed through circles far beyond his sight. Twice a month, a military chaplain stopped by, bringing fresh groceries, checking in with a warm handshake, sometimes sitting a spell to share news and stories from the wider world. The neighbors' visits became less about curiosity and more about respect. Tom Jennings stopped in now and then, bringing a sack of feed or just sharing a quiet moment on the porch. Even Rick Dalton, once the loudest skeptic, had taken to tipping his hat whenever their paths crossed, his smirk now replaced with a look of quiet regard. For Jack, life hadn't fundamentally changed. The chores remained, the land still demanded care. The days unfolded with their usual rhythm, but under the surface, something had shifted. He had become almost unknowingly a symbol. His simple choice to give without expecting, to stand by an old promise when no one else was watching, had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. Legacy, Jack realized, isn't always built in grand gestures or famous deeds. Sometimes it's carried in the small, stubborn decision to do what's right. Even when no one is looking, it's left in the hands that steady the burdens, that quietly lift the lives you touch without ever knowing the full measure of your reach. And so each morning, as the flag unfurled and the cattle grazed under a wide Wyoming sky, Jack Bennett sat on his porch with his coffee, content in the knowledge that one man's quiet choice had left a mark far beyond his fences. A reminder to the world that true kindness is never wasted and is eventually always seen. As we leave Jack Bennett's porch and the Wyoming sunrise behind, we're left with more than just a heartwarming story from Valor Stories. We're left with a lesson that cuts deep into modern life. In today's fast-moving, self-focused world, it's easy to believe that kindness has become rare, that sacrifice belongs to another generation, or that no good deed goes beyond your front door. But Jack reminds us that one quiet choice, one act of selflessness, can ripple farther than we'll ever know. For those of us watching, especially older adults who've weathered life's storms, this story touches on something familiar. The value of loyalty, the power of community, and the unshakable belief that character matters more than wealth or fame. In a world chasing viral moments and instant gratification, Jack's life shows us that true legacies are built not through applause, but through quiet, consistent acts of goodness. But here's where you come in. What do you think? Have you ever helped someone when no one was watching? Do you believe small acts of kindness still have the power to change lives today? Or do you think we've lost something in today's world of social media and self-promotion? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories, your reflections, and even your debates on what this means for our world today. Thank you for watching and for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners from Valor Stories. If this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another powerful story. Together, let's keep the spirit of kindness alive because you never know whose life you just might